This afternoon, you'll have a unique opportunity to hear the 2021 Economic Outlook from Dr. Ray Perryman. Dr. Perryman is president and CEO of the Perryman Group, an economic research and analysis firm based in Waco, Texas. Dr. Perryman has been called a genius by the Wall Street Journal, a world-class scholar by Business Week, the unofficial state economist by the New York Times, and the most quoted man in Texas by Texas Monthly. Is it me? I've never been called any of those things. Have you? Is it? Dr. Perryman has been honored by the Democracy Foundation for his role in promoting capitalism in China, the Asia and World Institute for promoting international trade and academic exchange, and the Systems Research Foundation for his contributions to the field of economic modeling. He has also received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Institute for Advanced Studies. He has played a key role in the creation of hundreds of thousands of jobs. He's a past recipient of the Outstanding Texas Leader Award and has been honored by the Texas legislature for his tireless efforts to build a better Texas. He devotes a substantial portion of his time to pro bono efforts seeking solutions to major social problems such as hunger, indigent health care, and child maltreatment. Dr. Perryman was inducted into the Texas Leadership Hall of Fame in 2014 and received the 2016 Cesar E. Chavez Legacy Award for his humanitarian efforts. Most recently, he was selected for the 2019 Go Global Award from the International Trade Council as the Outstanding Global Economic Analyst for his work on trade, energy, the environment, and other international issues. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Ray Perryman.
Okay, thank you very much. Everybody hear me? We're good? Somebody give me a thumbs up in the back? All right, very good. Thank you. It's great to be here with you. Obviously, we had to do this on a television camera last year, and I hope some of you are able to hear it. It's an honor to put on pants for you because I'm serious, man. I gave like 100 speeches on Zoom. I got kind of spoiled to this on the top and warm-ups on the bottom, but it is great to be here. I appreciate the kind introduction. That was very, very nice. I did a big voting rights thing yesterday, and it was broadcast out to a bunch of folks, and one of my daughters in D.C., who's an attorney, heard it. And when they introduced me, she texted me and said she wanted rebuttal time. So I was grateful that they didn't allow her to have that. But anyway, it's good. But introductions are a funny thing. I want to tell you a quick story about one introduction I had not long ago, it's been 3 or 4 years ago now, but it was kind of funny. And I said something I shouldn't have said because my mouth often gets ahead of my brain. And so I'm going to do the one thing, when you say something you shouldn't say and it gets you in trouble, I'm going to do the one thing you should always do is turn right around and do it again. So I'm going to do the same thing again. But I was speaking to the Governor's Economic Development Conference in Wisconsin. And at that time, Scott Walker, many of you remember Scott, he ran for president and that sort of thing. Scott was the governor. And he's introducing me. And he's reading this bio. And I knew him a little bit, but not very well. And we'd met a few times. But he was reading this bio, and he gets tired of reading the bio. And so he puts it down. He says, I'm going to make this short and sweet. He said, I called Rick Perry last night. And I told him Ray was speaking at my conference today. And he said, Ray Perryman's the smartest man in America. So ladies and gentlemen, here's the smartest man in America. That's not the introduction you want. A comedian will tell you the worst introduction you can give them is this guy's really funny, because then it kind of challenges the audience. And I'm thinking, if somebody did that in Texas, they would know it would take me 3 days to find my house on my own block, and they wouldn't be too impressed, But people in Wisconsin might not know that. So I thought, I said, I got to say something to get this crowd back. And so the first thing popped in my head. And I got up there, and I shouldn't have said it, but I said, I appreciate the introduction, but having Rick Perry call you smart is kind of like having Chris Christie call you thin. You might want to consider the source. And of course, that got back to Rick and Chris, and I got in trouble. But anyway. So anyway, but it's always great to be here. This is, as most of you know, my home county. I grew up over in Lindale, and I know the mayor's over here somewhere, and some of the city council, and we hopefully some other folks here. Some of the folks I went to school with are here, and some of them still speak to me, so that's nice. But anyway. It is a pleasure to be back with you, and I'm so glad we're all now to a point we can be together in a group and feel reasonably safe in doing that. I'm going to try to do several things today. I'm looking at the clock here. They put a clock up here. I think they're trying to tell me something. But I'm going to try to leave a little time for questions, but I will tell you I've got a lot to say, and I may get kind of wound up here because there's just a lot to cover. There's a lot going on. And I want to talk a little bit about what happened in the pandemic, not too much, but I want to kind of give you a little bit, maybe an approach that you hadn't thought about. Then I'll talk a little bit about the forecast and that sort of thing. And I understand they've made it available to all of you online. We put a little report out about Tyler and the outlook for Tyler in the U.S. and Texas, and it's available somewhere online. And so feel free to get that and look at it. And then I hope they're not charging you for it, but if they are, let me know. But I want some royalties. But anyway, I want to do that, the outlook. Then I want to talk about a few topics at the national level. I usually don't spend too much time on that, but everywhere I go these days, people are asking me about inflation, supply chain, and workforce. And so I want to kind of give you some perspective on those that I trust will be a little different than most of the things you've seen lately, and hopefully maybe get some insight on that. Then I want to talk about a few things that have changed during the pandemic a fair amount. And I guess the punchline of that is they've changed, obviously which changed a lot of things, but they haven't changed as much as you might think they've changed. And I want to talk about some of those. And one of those I'm probably going to spend a little more time on than I usually would in most places is energy and climate, because I know oil and gas is still a big important industry here. Not as important as where I live now in Odessa, but it's still important, and I know there's a lot of interest in that here. Then I want to talk about a few things that are not changing, and the last one of those are that not changing much, but really have some real profound implications for where we're going. And one of those is that I really want to focus on is the demographics, in particular what that means in Texas and what it means in terms of Texas education, because I really think this state has the greatest opportunity and the greatest challenge we've ever had looking ahead. And I want to try to, with an audience of this caliber, I want to try to and Scott, I mean, it's a good audience, but now I told some folks this morning, Scott was actually, we've known each other, God, how long? 30 years, maybe 25, 30 years. I don't know, a long time. Not as long as I've known Mullins. I mean, Mullins is like a grandfather to me, but we've known each other a long time. And when they were kind enough to give me the Texan of the Year award, Scott was there that night. And then a couple of years ago, they gave me the lifetime achievement in economic development or something in Indianapolis, and Scott was there. So every time I see him, I expect a big trophy, and I haven't gotten one today yet. But anyway, you can just send a check. That'll work fine. But anyway, so I want to I'm just going to plunge right in here and kind of try to get as much of this done as I can. The first thing I'll say about the pandemic is just how atypical this was for us. If you recall, we were in the 11th year of an economic expansion. It was the longest in history, and it still had legs. It wasn't dying of old age or anything, even though it was the longest one we ever had. It still had some legs to it before this hit. And normally, in recent years, when we have a downturn of some kind of recession, it's usually not because we ran out of steam. It's because we did something stupid. The mortgage thing was something stupid. The dot-com bubble was something stupid. The accounting scandal was something stupid. The syndication mess in the 80s was something stupid. I mean, they're all something stupid. We create some kind of bubble and it bursts, and then we have to fix it. This was a health crisis that hit out of nowhere. And it's funny how you remember things. I remember when I was here 2 years ago in January and with the larger group, at that point in time, somebody asked me about, what kept me up at night, or was one of the questions I got or something. And I said, the next recession will probably come from the outside somewhere. And we were just starting to hear about this COVID thing. And I said, it could be this thing that we're hearing about over in China. But in reality, I didn't think it was, because we'd heard about SARS before. And we'd heard, when you hear about these pandemics, avian flu, there's been a bunch of them. And I was for 30 years on the board of an insurance company. We used to model all that stuff and everything, but it never happened. And so I really didn't think there'd be much to it, but it shows how much my forecasting's worth. but anyway, obviously it's hit us very hard, and so this one's different, and there's not much good about it. But the good thing about one of the good things was, because nothing was broken, if we could get the pandemic under control, we didn't have to fix something in the economy. We didn't have to reform the banking system. We didn't have to reform the mortgage loan system. We didn't have to, do anything with the stock market or accounting regulations or anything. We didn't do any of that kind of stuff. There wasn't anything broken that we had to fix if we could manage not to break it as we worked our way through this thing. And that was tough because it lasted a lot longer than we thought it would. I remember back in March of 2020 when people started postponing my speeches. They'd say, we're going to do this in June. Okay. June would come along. Well, we're going to do it in August. And then August would come along. Well, we're going to do a Zoom in September. And that's kind of how that first year went. But anyway, it took a while. It took a lot of effort to get through it. But it was, as I say, something we hadn't seen before, and that made it more challenging to deal with, but at least we started from a strong place, and that was good, and we managed not to break it. Now, all the bills that you saw pass, the CARES Act and the ARPA Act and all those, there was good and bad about those. Obviously, we spent a whole lot of money. We ran up a whole bunch of debt, and we already had plenty of debt. A friend of mine who was a very successful politician, who now does other things, he got honest work finally, used to say that the difference between Republicans and Democrats was they would all spend every dime you gave them and then some, but the Republicans would feel bad about it. Well, in the last 15 years, nobody's even felt bad about it. They've just, let's cut taxes, let's spend more money, let's don't worry about making it up or anything. And we really built ourselves a big, huge deficit. And we had to really add to it this year. Normally, I would have been railing against that. I rail against it all the time. And those of you who've heard me for years and years know that. But this time around, when people suddenly don't have when a small business doesn't have any income for 6 months, I don't care how well run it is, they're going to struggle. When individuals suddenly, when 15% of the workforce is unemployed in 2 months, they're going to struggle. And so we had to do some of these things. They weren't perfect. We sent checks to dead people and we did all kinds of things. It was the government, what can I say? But we had to do that stuff, and it was literally a case of a bad choice versus a terrible choice. And we picked the bad choice. And that turned out to be, I think, on the whole, a good thing. I think the new one they're talking about now is too big and too much and got too much stuff in it. I won't go into all that detail today unless we have time for a question you ask me. But I think some of it was absolutely necessary, and we had to do it to get through this very unusual situation. The Federal Reserve also did a lot to get us through it. The Federal Reserve is the one government agency that has two things in common that are very useful. They have a lot of money, and they have the ability to make more of it, and they can ask forgiveness instead of permission. They don't have to get congressional approval to do a lot of what they do. So they bought up commercial paper. They bought up mortgages. They bought up the government bonds they always buy. They even bought PPP loans from the banks so that they'd have more money to lend. And they even made direct grants to some businesses. So the Fed stepped in and kept this thing afloat for us. At the same time, these bills came along and helped us. So anyway, we struggled through it. But the other thing I want to mention about it is how hard and how fast it hit us. Because you kind of have a vague, you kind of know that, but if you don't look at the numbers all the time like I do, you could lose sight of this. Back in 2008, when I was here talking, we were talking about in 2009, we were talking about the Great Recession. Worst one since the Great Depression. That was the mortgage bust. Okay, everybody remembers that. What was then the worst recession we'd had, we lost 9.4 million jobs in 14 months. So that's an average over 500,000 a month. there were some bad months in there, but 9.4 million jobs in this country in 14 months. In this one, we lost 22.5 million jobs in 2 months. 2.5 times as many jobs in 1/7 the time. We had never seen anything remotely like this before. And then we started coming back from it. But it was horrendous. The one number that I used to follow all the time, but most people didn't, that people started paying attention to during the pandemic, was one called initial claims for unemployment. And people start paying attention to it because it comes out every week and it gives you a snapshot of the economy. Now that's a long name. What it really means is layoffs. Because if you file your initial claim for unemployment, you do that when you get laid off. So it's a pretty decent proxy for just how many people are getting laid off. The highest that number had ever been was one time back in the 80s, it got to 695,000. In the Great Recession, it got to 660,000. Never broke 700,000 before. In April of 2020, it went to 6.9 million in 1 week. 10 times the highest number it had ever been. Okay, yeah, I see some mouths opening up now. Okay, I spoke to leadership Tyler this morning when I mentioned that. Somebody said, that's crazy. And she got the A. The rest of them, they're fighting for the rest of the curve right now. But and I found out later she went to UT Tyler. So wherever you guys are, you got a good one there. But not only did it go to 6.9 million, that 700,000 threshold we'd never broken before, we were above that for 54 straight weeks. For 54 consecutive weeks, we had more people laid off than had ever been laid off before since we've been keeping records. And that's a pretty startling number when you think about it. Now it's down to a record low level. I mean, we start coming back. We come back pretty quickly. The energy sector, which I mentioned, which I'll talk more about later, which is kind of important to y'all. In February of 2020, the world was using 101 million barrels of oil a day. By April, they were using 72. 30% drop in energy demand in basically about 35 days. That can only happen if you shut the world down. And that's what we basically did. And so, I mean, and I could go on and on, and I won't do that. But in terms of giving you a little perspective on it and bragging on Tyler a little bit, the U.S. lost a total of 14.5% of all our jobs, almost 15% of all our jobs the U.S. lost. We're still down about 2.5%, even though we've made a lot of comeback. Texas lost about 1.5 million jobs in 2 months. That was about 11.2% of our jobs. So a little better than the country. The country's about almost 15, we were 11.2. Finally got them back with the November numbers, the last numbers we got. We finally got above where we were before. That took 19 months. That's not bad, given how far down we went. Tyler, on the other hand, lost about 10% of your jobs, and you got them back in 15 months. That was one of the fastest recoveries of any city in the country. Okay, yeah, give yourselves a hand. You should, yeah. And if elected, no, I won't. I won't go there. I won't go there. By the way, part of what I'm going to say today, those of you who've known me a long time know I don't worry about the politics and that sort of thing, and I get in trouble with both parties all the time. But I'm going to say a couple of things, or at least one thing the Republicans don't like, and at least one thing Democrats don't like. And I'll give you a heads up when I'm doing it, because I want to be an equal opportunity offender, and I'm going to, so I'm going to do that today. And but anyway, I will. Talking about it, I mean, so Tyler was very resilient in coming back, and Tyler is 4% above its pre-pandemic high now. Texas is like 0.2% above its pre-pandemic high. So again, this area does very well. It speaks to your diversity. It speaks to some good leadership. It speaks to a lot of investment that's taken place here, and not having some extreme vulnerability. I mentioned I live in West Texas now. We're still down 15.3% down there. We're still down more than the U.S. was last April, because the oil and gas industry just tanked out there, and that's all there is, And there's oil and gas, and there's me. I mean, that's it, And which most of the time that's bad for me, but during the pandemic, it's a different situation. But anyway, so that kind of gives you perspective. As far as the outlook is concerned, again, there's a piece of paper available. It gives a whole bunch of numbers. I'm not going to read them to you. We're forecasting that the Tyler area will grow in the next 5 years in terms of your output at a rate of about 3.7%. That's well above what we're expecting for the nation, and a little bit below Texas. And the reason it's a little bit below Texas is basically two things. Number one, the tech industry in Austin is just killing it. I mean, they're just killing it right now. And they're about 10% of the economy, so they bring up the average pretty well. And the other one is, strangely enough, out there in West Texas, oil and gas is starting to come back. And it doesn't create a whole lot of jobs, but it creates a whole lot of output. Because if you think about it, when you have once you get a well brought in, it just kind of sits there and does this and just kind of pumps out gross product all the time, doesn't need much labor to keep it going or anything. So they generate a whole lot of output, not all that many jobs. And so people don't realize it, but out of the 13 million people that work in Texas, even when it's going great guns, oil is going to be 300,000 employees, 2.5% or so. I mean, oil is just not, employment-wise, it's not a big part of our economy. Output-wise, it's a huge part of our economy, about 15%. But so, that because of that, the output really gets stacked up. We look for the employment here in the area to grow at a 2.2% rate, which will outperform the state. We'll grow faster than the state in terms of employment. And again, that speaks to the diversity, the biosciences, a lot of other things that are going on here. And and I think bodes very well for your future. I'm going to talk about some things in a minute when I get into some of the things how some things are changing that I think will even help Tyler do better going forward in the future. But the first thing I want to do, I think, is kind of focus on these national issues that everybody's talking about today: inflation, supply chains, and that sort of thing. I guess I'll start with supply chain. You can pick any one you want to; it doesn't matter. Think about the economy of the world as a $100 trillion engine. The biggest engine you've ever seen in your life, because that's how much it generates every year, about $100 trillion, okay? And let's say you suddenly stop it cold. And I don't mean you throw the brakes on. I mean you turn off the key, jump out, and let it hit a tree, okay? I mean you tear that sucker up, okay? And then after that, you grab a bunch of sledgehammers and you bang on it some more. And then you let it sit out in the cold and rust for about 6 months. And then you say, okay, crank her up. Okay, might find some places that need a little oil, a little grease, maybe a little polish or something. That's what we did to the world economy. And we suddenly shut it down with literally no warning. And then we try to crank it back up. Well, everything doesn't go very smoothly when you do that. And consequently, we didn't have the ports all set up just right to get all the stuff in. And some of the manufacturers didn't have everything they needed. And some things deteriorated. As you know, when your machinery sits idle for a few months, it doesn't like that too much. And so you had just a whole lot of things that had to happen to get the supply chain back on track. You had to get the stuff into the ports, and you had to get the stuff into the trucks and then out to the people. And some of the stuff they couldn't make because they didn't have the chips, because the chip plants got shut down. And on top of that, there's only 3 big chip plants in the world. One of them had a big fire right in the middle of this too. So we had a lot of things that help us. Here in Texas, we had a cold snap. Y'all might have heard about that last February. That kind of slowed it down some too. And so, a lot of things like that happen. The good news is it's being fixed, okay? And one of the nice things, I said this to the group this morning, one of the nice things about markets is as soon as you create a problem, at the same instant, you create the incentive to solve the problem, because all of a sudden there's profit, there's money in solving that problem. And so it gets people working and thinking and that sort of thing, and we're doing better. You also kind of have to watch the way they report the news sometimes, because they'll mess you up. The last month they're reporting we had a record trade deficit in the United States. And all you heard on the news was, oh, that's bad. We're getting foreign competition's killing us. We're not keeping pace, all that kind of stuff. The reason we had a trade deficit last month that was an all-time record was we got to unload a bunch of those boats that had been sitting in the water. Because they don't count as imports till we register them as imports. They got to be inside the country before they're imports. So all that stuff that was sitting out in the water, we got a lot of it in. The ports started running double and triple shifts and that sort of thing. That's why we had a record trade deficit. I mean, we have a trade deficit anyway, but the reason it was so big was we're finally solving the supply chain problem. And I think over the next 4 or 5 months or so, we'll get it pretty much back under control. And that's actually part of the inflation problem, which I want to talk about, because everybody's talking about that. And everybody's trying to compare inflation now to the 1980s, because we just saw these statistics. It's the worst it's been since then and all that kind of stuff. There is no comparison, okay? And I'll get into that in just a minute. And I can tell you for those of you who are old enough to remember, and increasingly when I say that to crowds, it's fewer and fewer people, because, people tell me I'm getting old. I don't believe it, but people tell me I'm getting old. But anyway, if anybody says anything, you're out, okay? I travel with security, okay? But basically, if you go back and think about the inflation for just a minute, then I'll get back to the 80s. But when you think about inflation, the classic old definition you've bound to have heard at some point in your life is too much money chasing too few goods. That's the definition of inflation. Well, we had both halves of that happening now. Normally it's just one at a time. Too much money chasing too few goods. Let's think about that for a minute. Too much money. Well, a bunch of people, wages have gone up, but a bunch of people got stimulus money, and the way the government has to do this is they can't go door to door and say, okay, you need some help, so we'll help you. You don't need help, so we won't help you. They can't do it that way. That doesn't work. It's not practical. They make rules that apply to everybody. So, a lot of people got money. It was just extra spending money, because they didn't really have to have it, but they qualified for it, and so a lot of people got a lot of extra money. In fact, during the pandemic, when output went down, employment went down, income went up, because we put so much money in people's pockets. So people had money, and they could get out again. They've been cooped up for 6 months, 8 months, 9 months. So what happens? You've got all this money in your pocket, and you can go out and do something with it now. So what do? You go spend it. That's the too much money. Okay, I just told you about the supply chain. That's the too few goods. So we had too much money chasing too few goods. That brings inflation. Now, as I say, the good thing about that piece of it is that's a short-term problem. Yes, it's high right now. It was tough during the Christmas season, but that will work itself out over the next 5 or 6 months because people will spend all that money. That'll shake out. We'll get the supply chain fixed. That'll shake out. And so that piece of it is likely not to be around for a long time. However, there's also a long-term piece to it. And that is, as I mentioned earlier, we put all this money out there, increased the money supply, the Federal Reserve did what they did and that sort of thing. And so we had all this money out there, and we already had big deficits. That is inflationary in the long term. And we think it's going to be about 0.5% added to long-term inflation. That doesn't do a great deal of harm or anything, but we think it'll only be about 0.5% above where it was. And the reason, among many things, we've done a lot of modeling to get there, but the other thing, if you want a shortcut way, if you go look at the interest rate on 10-year bonds or 20-year bonds, government bonds, those are basically risk-free obligations that you hold hold for potentially for a long period of time. So what you're buying when you buy those basically is you're buying what you expect future inflation to be. You're getting ahead of purchasing, keeping your purchasing power in place. And those interest rates have gone up about 0.4%, 0.5%, something like that in the last few months. So the markets are also expecting something like that. They haven't exploded and doubled or tripled or anything like that, but they have gone up some and pretty steadily. So the market is anticipating some long-term inflation out of it. Now, the reason I say it's not like the 80s, I mean, we had a couple of months there where we can compare it and that sort of thing, but we institutionalized inflation in the 1980s. Again, for those of you who remember those days, at one point in time, inflation was 14%, mortgage interest rates were 18%, okay? And that's a far cry from the less than 3% we have for a lot of mortgages today. So, I mean, things have changed a lot. And what happened was, and again, a lot of history, but when President Carter was running against Ronald Reagan for president, they had a big debate, and Reagan defined something he called the misery index, where you add up inflation and unemployment, and that was your misery index. And it was very effective. He communicated very well. He won the election. So he wanted to fight inflation. And so he got a guy in to head the Federal Reserve named Paul Volcker, who's a very, very talented guy, very good friend of mine. He died a few years ago, but wonderful guy, very, very smart. And he did. He got inflation under control. In the process, he drove the unemployment rate up to 12% because that's the only way you could do it. He had to clamp down on the money supply in a big way. But they took inflation out of the system at that point. And obviously, before Reagan, by the time he got it solved, unemployment was what everybody cared about, not inflation. So you can't win if you're in that business. But anyway, I got pulled into that in a big way because as I say, I was a baby economist, and my dissertation had been the model the Federal Reserve had to use in order to make that thing work. And so I got pulled in with Volcker at a very young age and got to work with those guys, and that was kind of fun. But regardless, for those of you who were around at that time, and I know there's some bankers out here that remember this, routinely back then, if you put your money in a savings account at the bank, just a regular old savings account, you take it out anytime you wanted to, it paid 5.25% annually. Now think about that. Today it's, less than 1%. Okay. What that meant was that was kind of a floor on inflation. You just put your money there and didn't do anything. And the bank paid you 5%. That means they got to lend it out for more than 5%. We've institutionalized inflation with that. All that went away in this process that we went through. And so we've wrung all that out. Nothing we're doing now brings that back, okay? This is a temporary thing caused by all this pandemic, but it's not, the long-term impact is there, but it's pretty small. And I hope I didn't go too far into inside baseball to get you there, but that's it. Now let's talk about the workforce. If you listen to the media, it sounds like nobody's ever going to work again. We just have this horrible workforce situation. And the truth is we do need a lot of workers right now. We have like 10.5 million job openings right now. What they forget to tell you is, and some of you who are in business remember this, the biggest problem you had 2 years ago before the pandemic started was we didn't have enough workers. That was the biggest problem before this thing ever started. We had 8 million job openings in, and that was the all-time record. We now have 10 million. So you can blame 80% of it on what was already there and 20% on the pandemic. This is not a pandemic-related thing, and notion that nobody's ever going to go to work again. The workforce participation rate, what percentage of the population that's working age works, has been going down for a long time. It went way up in the 50s and 60s as women entered the workforce, and it's been going down ever since. The month before the pandemic, it was 63.4%. Today, it's 61.7% and rising. So it's 1.7% below where it was when the pandemic started. That's not a massive walkout of all the workers in the country. Okay. Now it's 2 million people because we've got like 150 million people in the workforce. You take take 1.7% of that gets you from 8 million to 10.5 million, But it's just that, and that number is going up as people are coming back in the workforce. The notion that nobody's ever going to come back is ludicrous. That quit rate that comes out, they talk about every month. We do have a lot of people quitting, but they're not quitting because they're leaving the workforce. They're quitting because they got a better job. And that's and that's basically when you peel the onion back, that's what we're seeing with those numbers. And the other thing was that the notion that everybody's going to work from home from now on. I hear that one a lot. And they're never going to go back to the office again. Well, here's the real story. Okay, at the height of the pandemic, 35% of us worked from home. Okay, today that number's 13%. So 2/3 of those folks who are working from home are already back at the office. Okay, and I'm sure a bunch of you are in that category. You work from home for a while and you're back at the office. I'm in that category. You work from home for a while, now you're back at the office. And then, and before the pandemic ever started, 6% of the people work from home. So it's gone from 6 to 13 and it's still dropping. So I think it'll probably settle out somewhere around 10, 11% or something, a fair amount more than we had before, but still, most people are going to be back at the office working. I mean, that's how this thing's going to kind of evolve and shake out along the way. And so again, it is a very real problem, but it's driven by demographics. I want to say more about that later. It's not driven by the pandemic. It's driven by the fact our birth rate goes down all the time. Speaking of the media, I love this one. This is one of my favorite ones. They always get mad at me because they call me for quotes, and I always say something that nobody else is saying. And I'll tell you about one of those in a minute. But anyway, the numbers came out that show the lowest birth rate we've ever had in 2020. And man, they all lined up to do stories about how the pandemic affected the birth rate. Let's think about that just 1 second. Okay? Just a minute. I'm not going to put you into higher mathematics here. But we shut down around the middle of March of 2020. So about 10, 11 weeks into the year, we shut down. Okay? Last time I checked, it takes about 40 weeks to get one of those little scuttlers out. Okay? So basically, the reason we had a low birth rate in 2020 wasn't because of anything that happened in 2020 in the pandemic. It's what happened in 2019, okay? And that's why we had a birth rate. Now, 2020 will be interesting when we get those numbers because two things were going on. No, I'm serious. I mean, the pandemic was scaring everybody to death, but on the other hand, you couldn't go anywhere and do anything. So, so we don't know how that was going to be. But in all honesty, it will probably continue to be a declining birth rate because we've been having that for about 15 years now. And I don't see any reason why it's going to change very, very much from that. But it'll be interesting to see. But the point is, it wasn't the pandemic that caused that. We've got an underlying a demographic issue. And I'm going to say a lot more about demographics here in a few minutes. But I wanted to point that one out as I went along just because I thought it was funny, And some of you did too, so that's good. That's one of the nice things I've learned in speaking over years. I've learned this thing. It's very important. I'm up here and you're out there. So I get to say whatever I want to. You don't have to like it, but I'll say whatever I want to. And as you can tell, whatever pops in my head, I pretty much say it. And as sometimes gets me in trouble, as I told you about. But anyway, I now want to talk about a few things that are changing and how they're changing. And the short answer is not much for most of them. But things the pandemic really affected. Retail is one. For the last 15 years, we've had a trend every year. We buy a little bit more online than we did the previous year, percentage-wise. We've gotten more comfortable with it. It's gotten better. It's gotten easier and that sort of thing. We all more shopping online. The pandemic kind of put that on steroids because a bunch of folks who didn't want to shop online had no choice for a while. And so they started doing it, and some of them kind of liked it. Bring the stuff to your house, and it's kind of a nice deal. So I think we accelerated a little bit, but we didn't change it completely because people like to be out and about among people. I dare say most of you like this a lot better than seeing me on a TV screen last year. I know I certainly do. It's more fun to be in groups. It's more fun to work in groups. You can get more done. There's more synergy if you're physically there. If people like to shop, they like to talk to other people. They like to ask questions of the people who are waiting on them and that kind of thing. So there's an advantage there. Now, probably a little more on the online side than there was before, but retailers are seeing that. Are seeing that people like to shop again, and we certainly saw that during the Christmas season here in Texas. I don't know if you've seen the numbers yet or not, but the sales tax absolutely boomed in Texas. We set an all-time record in October for October. We set an all-time record in November for November. We set an all-time record in December for December. Prior to the pandemic, we'd only had 4 months in the history of Texas where we collected over $3 billion in retail sales tax. We've done it the last 9 months in a row. So, whoa, yeah, somebody say, yeah. And whoever you are, if elected, okay. Yeah, I hope you're a retailer. But anyway, and that's despite supply chain problems and all the other bad stuff you heard. I mean, that's going to be fine. Travel's going to change a little bit. And not a whole lot, but a little bit. I think we'll see a higher percentage of people doing cars instead of planes and that sort of thing. But they're all coming back. We're now seeing enplanements getting above prior levels and that sort of thing. Again, this new variant slowed it down a little bit, but we still are seeing that every month now. More Texans or more people are flying into Texas every month now than flew in the same month in 2019 before the pandemic. So we started in July, we passed that curve, and we've been catching up ever since. And so that's very important. But I mean, it will change. We've got different protocols. It's a little more hassle than it used to be. We've been through that before. I mean, 9/11, which we just celebrated an anniversary on not long ago. I don't know if celebrate's the right word. But if you think about it, before 9/11, travel was very different, and we adapted very quickly. If you go back, to 9/11, so you got 20 years and 3 months ago, something like that, okay, but just before 9/11. If Grandma was coming to town, y'all hadn't seen her in a while, and you wanted to bring 50 people to the gate, along with a cake and a bunch of food and some balloons and streamers and all kind of stuff, it was no problem. They would accommodate you. It was very easy. After 9/11, we couldn't do that anymore. We all adapted. It's been kind of a hassle, but we adapted. And that's what we do. We adapt. And so I think, again, you'll see some change, not too much. Real estate is going to change some. Again, people act like nobody's ever going to go back to an office. That's not true. That's not going to happen. Most people are already back. They did a survey recently, the Fortune 500 folks. 96% of the CEOs of the Fortune 500 said, yeah, we want our people back in the office, because you can do better sitting around a table than you can on a big bunch of Zoom cameras. I mean, it's just better when you're face to face. And so we're already seeing that begin to happen. I think they will accommodate people, let them work 1 day a week from home. Some of them are like, if you have the big cities where there are offices downtown and everybody lives in the suburbs, some of them are putting satellite offices in the suburbs so it makes it a little easier for people. I mean, they're doing a lot of things to accommodate the workforce shortage, but it basically is going to happen. And they'll repurpose some of the buildings. They'll turn them into residential. They'll turn them into retail. I mean, that's what we do in this world. We adapt. I remember very well, because I'm old, back in 1990, when we were in the middle of the savings and loan bust and the oil bust and all that stuff, there was an article in the Austin paper that said Austin has a 25-year supply of real estate, commercial real estate. 25-year supply in 1990. If that were true, they wouldn't have built anything until 2015. I don't know if any of you ever go to Austin or not, but they built a couple of buildings in the meantime, okay? But the most interesting thing was not 2015, but in 1993, just 3 years later, the National Association of Industry and Office Parks did this big, huge survey trying to determine what were the hottest real estate markets in the country. What do you think number one was? Austin, Texas. Went from hopelessly out of control, never come back again, to hottest in the world in 3 years, because that's what we do, we adapt. I think what you're probably going to see with this thing is, on an average day, a few fewer people in the office, but a little more square footage allocated per person, because we've really been squeezing that down lately. And I think you'll see that because you'll space out those desks a little more, you'll space out those cubicles a little more. More people have an office they want to close. Break room may have to be a little bigger, those kind of things. So you'll see a little more space per worker and fewer workers. But on the whole, I don't think you'll see dramatic changes there. The other one that I know is interesting to everybody is economic development is changing. It's changing partially because we have more opportunities, because a lot of people figured out during this thing, this outsourcing, it's okay because we got a lot of cheap stuff from China, Malaysia, and South Korea, but it's not all it's cracked up to be sometimes, because when you need stuff and you can't get it, then you're in trouble. And so they're still going to buy the cheap stuff, obviously, but they want a factory here. And we're already seeing benefit from that right here in Texas. TI has just announced a huge chip plant in Sherman. Samsung's just announced a huge chip plant down in Taylor, close to Austin, which is the home of Louis Mueller, which makes the best brisket in Texas other than my backyard. Just saying, okay? I know my brisket. By the way, the best rub in Texas is over at Stanley's. Get that rib rub. Man, it's good, okay? Okay, good, okay. When they mention all those things, people have called me a genius and most quoted man, this, that, and the other. They didn't mention that the Dallas Morning News called me the state's premier barbecue connoisseur. That's the one I'm proud of. I worked hard to earn that one. But anyway, that's basically there's going to be more opportunities. It's going to be tougher competition because everybody's trying to get everything because everybody was so hard hit by this thing trying to come back. But what's going to change a lot is workforce is going to be number one. It's been that way for a long time. I said we've got a workforce issue. That's a given. But the other thing that's going to change is a lot of the things that I think really help this area are going to become much more important. Education facilities and opportunities, healthcare facilities and opportunities, quality of life, amenities, the beauty of a community. All those things have always been on the list. Well, now as workers become more and more important and people recognize, we may have to teach our kids remotely. We may have to get our health care remotely, all those kind of things. Those things, broadband, having access to things, those are going to be much more important. And I think that can really help a community like Tyler because you have a whole lot of those things going for you. Now I want to spend a couple of minutes on another one that's going to change, and I'm going to spend more than a couple of minutes on it, and that's energy. I want to do a fairly deep dive on energy and climate. And talk about it and say this is going to be different. I almost forgot to pick on Republicans. Dang, I'm sorry. Let me do that right quick. One of the things Texas now has to overcome, and we have a lot of data to support this because I just talk about data. The recent legislation we've passed regarding voting restrictions, regarding sexual identity, reproductive rights, all those things, whatever your feelings are about it politically, religiously, or any other way, that is a negative to some companies and where they choose to locate. And so that is something we're going to have to overcome. Now, we have a lot of assets to overcome it, but that is something. Okay, you've had yours. Now let me talk about the Democrats. They got climate completely wrong, okay? And so I'm going to talk about that one for a few minutes here. No, go ahead. That's fine. That's fine. Okay. Well, I don't know since I'm hitting both of them, I don't know who you're applauding for, but maybe I'll run as an independent. No, I'm not going to run for anything, but I run from that stuff. But anyway, on energy, first of all, with regard to climate science and the fact of what's happening with the climate, and we got some really smart folks that work with me at my office, and we've delved into it very deeply. I know a bunch of the Nobel Prize winners who created a bunch of this stuff. I talk to them a lot. It's real. It's happening. The issue is how do we deal with it? Okay, and the way the prescriptions we have to deal with it now simply won't work. And I'm very concerned about it. I've testified to Congress several times about it because I really think they have it wrong, and I'm hoping somebody can move the needle up there. And here's why I say that. First of all, it's a global problem. We can't solve it. China's greenhouse gas emissions last year exceeded those of all 37 countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the advanced economies of the world, all the ones you think about. China's emissions exceeded all of those combined. So it's a global problem. It's going to take a global solution. That's one thing that I would mention about it. The other one is, if you look at the policy we're putting out, it's like we just get rid of hydrocarbons and the problem's solved. There's a little problem with that. We can't get rid of hydrocarbons. And oil and gas are going to continue to be very, very important to the energy future of the world for decades and decades to come. And we've done a whole lot of analysis here, and I'm going to give you the high points here. Today, I mentioned the economy, by the way, went from 101 million barrels a day down to 72. Right after that happened, some internet site, they do this stuff all the time, sent me this note and said, do you think we'll ever see 101 million barrels of oil again? Like we'll survey 100 economists and see what you say. And so I didn't even think about it. I just checked the box and sent it back. They called me a couple of days later and said, well, we got the results back. It's 99-1. I said, well, I don't have to guess who the one is, And because they all didn't think we'd ever see 101 again. It's 99 right now, in the middle of Omicron. It's 99, okay? It's going to be 101 in the next 2 or 3 months, and it's going to be higher than that later in the year. And now, at this point, a year later, the Energy Department is forecasting we will average 101 this year. And they were saying we'd never see it again a year and a half ago. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But the bottom line is, today in the world, oil and gas will contribute 57% of the total energy. Okay. If you add coal, which will be, it may decline a little bit in the future, because it has worse properties than some of the others, and most countries are moving away from it in some way. But if you throw coal in, it's 85%. If you throw in nuclear, which probably won't grow much because it's got a lot of potential, but every time we start, there's an accident, and that sets it back for 10 years. And hydro, and pretty much any place that's got fast-running water, we've already dammed it up. So basically, those aren't going to grow much at all. But if you add those in here to 96%, after 10 years of enormous growth, wind, solar, biomass, hydrogen, all that stuff is 4% of the world's energy today. And that's after years of enormous growth, okay? Now let's fast forward 30 years to the time when they say we're going to be, that we won't be using oil and gas anymore. We'll need twice as much energy then as we need today. because the growth in the world is happening in these emerging countries that are starting to manufacture stuff. They've been agrarian economies for most of their existence, or minerally-based economies. They're now manufacturing economies. They're growing. They're developing a middle class. Those 37 OECD countries I mentioned, the advanced economies today, they have 1 million people in them. They have 1 billion people in them, and they use half the world's energy. The other 6.5 billion people use the other half. It's not going to stay that way. All those countries are developing middle classes. They're going to have consumer goods. A whole lot of things are happening in that world. So that growth is energy intensive. And because that 30 years from today, we're going to get to the point we need twice as much energy. So you got this piece of the energy pie, and it's a very important piece. I've loved renewable energy. I've done a lot of work to help it grow around the world. But it's 4% of today's pie. In 30 years, the pie is going to be twice as big, and they want it to be close to 100%. That can't happen. If Tyler grew that fast as that type of energy would have to grow for the next 30 years, you would be bigger than Dallas and Houston combined. Okay? I mean, you just can't grow that fast physically. You can't do it. And we've thrown in our models, we've thrown in, black swans, like when the iPhone came along, something that totally changes the world and really makes the energy more efficient. We've thrown in a couple of those, you still don't get there. We think they can get to about 35%, maybe, something like that, and which is great. But that's still going to leave a whole lot for everything else. Now, what that says is the solution needs to be not to get rid of oil and gas, but to burn it cleaner. This really is not rocket science. And a whole lot of companies know that they're afraid to say it right now, because if you say we're going to burn oil and gas now, Wall Street will kill you, the regulators will kill you, so nobody says it. But a lot of companies, a lot of the major oil companies are spending hundreds of billions of dollars on ways to capture carbon at their refineries. There's a plant going in West Texas right now, $7 billion plant that's going to make gasoline out of natural gas that reduces emissions by 60%. Electric vehicles, you hear a lot about those. They're not going to take over the world. It's physically impossible for the world to run entirely on electric vehicles with the infrastructure that would have to happen, the battery storage, many other issues. We're going to have a lot of them, and that's great. But if you think about the emerging world where all this growth is going to happen, right now what they're driving is 1950s U.S. cars. What you're going to be driving in 30 years is 1980s U.S. cars. Okay, so there's certain things you can't change. Okay, but beyond that, I'm running up on my time here. But I wish that clock wasn't here. Then I could just pretend I didn't know I was going over. Electric vehicles are important, and I hope they grow a lot. We've done a lot of work trying to help those grow as well. But here's what they do: the incremental source of fuel for electricity in the world is natural gas. So when you do an electric car, you're not getting rid of hydrocarbons. You're changing the way you use hydrocarbons. And it helps a lot, because right now, if you have internal combustion engines, the pollution's going up and down the road. Well, if you replace a lot of those with electric cars, you still have the emissions, but they're coming at a power plant. It's a whole lot easier to sequester the carbon at a fixed point in space than going up and down the road. So you're going to see a lot more electric cars. They're going to be a big deal, but they're not going to totally replace the energy sector. So the key to that is we are going to use oil and gas in the future. My problem is right now when Washington has these things that cause people to make announcements like we're not going to have any internal combustion engines by 2030, or the major auto companies, what that says to me is, we're going to bail them out again, But hopefully, as they're saying that, they're not putting all their eggs in that basket, and I don't think they are. But in any case, climate change is real. We have to deal with it, but there are ways to deal with it within a structure that makes sense. And we're going to have to change the way we do some things. The energy companies recognize that they're diversifying, but they're keeping their other investments. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that out because I know this is an important issue for you guys. The last thing I want to talk about, which will lead to the very last thing I want to talk about, is 3 different things that I've changed a little bit, but not too much. And the reason I want to talk about them is they are the most important things that drive economies. We focus on what the Fed's doing at the last meeting and how the balance sheet looks and where they're going to raise interest rates next year. They are, by the way, going to raise interest rates next year. They pretty much told us that. That's not breaking news or anything, but not too much, but a little bit. And they are going to start to back up their balance sheet some because it's way bloated right now. But anyway, there's fundamental things that drive economies. One of them is the cost and trade patterns in the world. I mean, people buy stuff because it's cheaper to buy it somewhere else. That's the whole comparative advantage thing that drives the whole world economy. That hadn't changed much. We didn't make stuff cheaper or more expensive from one country to another too much because of the pandemic. If to the extent we have any change at all, it's what I mentioned before. People want to bring some of their suppliers back to the United States. So that'll probably help us a little bit. The next one that's very, very important is technology. You know, what's the next big thing going to be? And to the extent that the pandemic had much impact on it, it probably accelerated a little bit because it created new needs. We had a whole lot of investment in security after 9/11, a whole lot of new innovations and things changed. We probably wouldn't have had quite as fast without 9/11. We've now been told we have some other needs in the country, some other things to think about, so we'll invest in those. So that one probably goes up a little bit too. The final one is demographics. And that demographics is a very boring subject, but boy, it affects everything. It's just how many people are born, how many people die, and where they move around in between. That's what demographics is. It sounds boring, but man, it drives the economies all the time. The reason we have a workforce shortage right now is because the baby boomers aged out and the young folks stay in school longer. I mean, that's why we have a labor shortage. I mean, it's all about demographics. And I want to talk about Texas demographics and education just 1 minute, because you are a very important group of people, and you're leaders in this community, and we all have a huge opportunity, a huge challenge, and I want to leave you with that today. First of all, in terms of the opportunity, the census just came out. You know, probably you've seen some of the numbers starting to come out. There are 1 million fewer young people in the country under the age of 18 today than there were 10 years ago. We have fewer young people. That's never happened before since we started counting in 1790. We have fewer young people today than we had 10 years ago. 1 million fewer people. That tells us something about the future workforce and why this is going to be with us for a while. We have 440,000 more in Texas. So another way to say that is the rest of the country is down 1.5 million, and we made up a third of it. You know, I mean, so we have young people in Texas. That is a huge resource for our future. Okay. Then there's the challenge that comes with it. According to the census, 39.7% of us are Anglo, and 39.3% of us are Hispanic. Okay? Now, those lines have been coming together very rapidly. And I can tell you at some point on some quiet morning when nobody was looking in the last 6 or 8 months, those lines crossed. We now have more Hispanics in Texas than Anglos. And we've been a majority-minority state for a long time. And that's great. That brings diversity. It brings all kinds of things, but it brings a challenge. And here's the challenge from an education perspective. Hispanic kids, because it is a younger population, they make up 52% of the school enrollment in Texas. Those families have 5.7% of the household wealth in Texas. 50% of the kids, 5% of the money. That's not a good combination. If you add the black population, it's been growing very slowly, but it's 12% of the school-age population and a little less than 2% of the money. So you put all that together and you've got 2/3 of the kids and about 8% of the money. With Anglos, we actually have 125,000 fewer kids in school that are Anglos today than we had 10 years ago, but we have 55,000 more that are economically disadvantaged. Okay? So what we're looking at here is when these kids need a summer enrichment program or a tutor because they're falling behind or some software or something like that, it's going to be very difficult for those families to do that. And so we have a real challenge here that a lot of places don't have. 20% of our kids have a language difficulty in school. And here's the one that gets to me because I do a lot of work in that area. I think in the introduction, Lee mentioned the Chavez Award and all that stuff. But here's one that gets to me. If you walk into 2 classrooms in Texas, random classrooms, on average, 1 kid is homeless. Okay? So, I mean, there's a whole lot of real challenges we have out there in trying to educate these folks. And most of those numbers are pre-COVID. COVID made it much worse because a lot of people, 10%, 11% of our kids in Texas completely lost contact with school last year because they didn't have some type of internet access for remote learning. And so, I mean, that's a lot to make up. We have a huge challenge there in terms of education. I'm only going to give you a couple of more numbers because I know I'm beating you to death with them right now, but I do think these are significant numbers that we need to know. There's another number that I find interesting that the Census Bureau about every 2 or 3 years does this thing where they look at how many people that grow up in a state end up living in that state. They may go away for a while, but how many people who basically grow up in a state end up back in that state? And not surprisingly, Texas is number 1. Almost 80%, 78% of the people who are raised in Texas end up in Texas. So make no mistake about it. We'll bring some folks in from other places, but the folks we educate here in Texas are going to be the workforce of the future. And that's the challenge we face. And the last number I'll give you on all this is one that I did with my crazy models and stuff, because one thing you can do with those things is ask them questions and then kind of sort of answer them. And I said, let's make this assumption. Let's assume our school system in Texas, public, private, universities, colleges, career, law school, medical school, technical school, the whole 9 yards. Let's assume it all stays at the exact same quality level it is now, it graduates the same percentage of people that it does now as the population grows. Then I added 3 words to the scenario: by ethnic group. And then I just let demographics do what we already know demographics is going to do just by looking at these numbers, okay? 15 years from today, not the average household, but the average person in Texas. So if you're in a household of 4 people, we're talking about $24,000 here, because they're going to have $6,000 a year less income, taking away inflation and all that. In today's purchasing power, $6,000 less income per person in Texas than we have today. That makes us a low-income state. It means we don't have a highly skilled workforce. It means we have a whole lot of social needs. So we'll be one of those low-growth, high-tax states if we don't solve this problem. And again, it's kind of a depressing thing, but I think it's very, very important. I think in our communities, you have a great community here. You try to do things to promote this community. The single most important thing you can do is make sure that the kids in this community get the type of education opportunities that they need. You have great facilities, great universities, the new medical school that I was privileged to work on, all kinds of great things going on. But it's very, very important that we educate these kids, because they truly are our future. And on that happy note, thank you very much. I'll take as many questions as they'll let me. Okay. Thank you, thank you. And if elected, oh, yes, sir.
If the number that I have is correct, in the third quarter of 2021, fiscal year 2021, federal receipts did not cover entitlements and service on the debt. That obviously can't continue. How does that problem get solved, and what does it mean for the broader economy?
Very, very good question. I'll repeat it in case you couldn't hear it. He's talking about the fact that on average, and I'm going to say it in a little bit broader terms than you did, third quarter numbers, or you stated them correctly, but on average, entitlements today take about 60 cents of every federal dollar collected, and interest takes about 6 or 7% cents, and that's about how much we collect. So basically, all we collect is the money for entitlements, if you want to look at it that way, and interest on the debt. We don't collect anything for roads, for education, for national defense, for homeland security, anything else, if you want to look at it that way. And so, what do we do? And the answer is, it's not sustainable. We don't have to balance the budget. That would be pretty impossible to do right now, because when you only take in $2 for every $3 that you spend, the only way you can get by with that is if you don't go to jail for printing money, and that's what separates the federal government from everybody else. But we can do some things to bring it under control, and it takes 2 things that are very, very difficult to achieve. One is bipartisanship, because you can't get there on either side of the balance sheet by itself. You got to use both of them. You got to do some things with spending. You got to do some things with taxes. And the other thing it takes, which may be even harder these days, is they have to be willing to look beyond the next election. Because you solve these problems over generations. You restructure the retirement system where people are better off and we save trillions of dollars. And you can do that. We've shown them how to do it. You can definitely do that sort of thing. But it's going to take that type of effort. There's been a number of commissions established over the years to try to do it. And there's been different times when politicians got together to show you how different the world was. There was one where Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell got together and came up with a plan only about 7 or 8 years ago. So the world's changed a lot. But there have been a number of bipartisan plans floated on ways to go about doing this, basically taking advantage of actuarial situations. And I'll talk about that. I'll talk about one of them. And it's a touchy subject, but Social Security is a very good example, because you can't change it for people the age of myself and some of you, but you can change it for our kids and grandkids, and you can actually make them better off and still save a lot of money. When Social Security was created, there were 27 people working for every retiree. The life expectancy of a retiree at age 65 was 3 years. So you had 27. So you had basically what we called a biological rate of interest. I mean, you can make this thing work out really nice. Everybody chips in a little money. You take care of it. It's all good. Today, there are 2.5 people working for every retiree. The life expectancy in this country is 77 or so. But if you've made it to 65, you've kind of beat some of the odds. If you've made it to 65, your life expectancy, and many people retire at 62 or something like that now or earlier, your life expectancy is about 20, 25 years. So, because you've beaten a whole bunch of that curve that keeps the average at 77, you've gotten past a bunch of it. All the crazy teenage stuff and all that, you've gotten past all that. So and you survived. So basically, it's a situation now where that's not a sustainable way to do it. Because with the demographic shifting, more people retiring with the baby boomers, fewer people entering the workforce, that 2.5 even is going to go down. And at the same time, we've baked in additional benefits, we've inflation-proofed it and all kinds of stuff, all of which I'm not saying any of those are not good things to do, but they create an imbalance that you can't sustain. And so consequently, we have to address these things at some point in time. And the difficulty we have is they come together, they put together these plans, and it calls for some additional revenue, and the Republicans say no, and it calls for some spending cuts, and the Democrats say no, and it dies on the vine. So the one good thing I can tell you about capitalism, the one rule I've learned about capitalism over my 40 some odd years of doing this is when something has to happen, it will. We may push it to the very edge, but that's what capitalism does. It incentivizes things to get done. And we're getting relatively close to that point where you'll see that happen. But yes, it is a very big problem. You've identified it very well and something we do have to address, but it's a long-term systemic issue, much like the workforce thing. We're going to have to deal with that, and there's all kinds of things we can do with immigration policy and technology and all kinds of things, but there's these big issues require big solutions. They're not the sort of things you can write the solution on the back of an envelope. But you absolutely identified what is a very significant issue for us. And as I said earlier, I'll say one more thing. I got to shut up about this. But with the deficits, I don't fault the deficits last year to get through the pandemic, but the deficits we ran up during 11 years of consecutive years of economic expansion is unconscionable. There's no excuse for doing that, absolutely none. And neither party did anything to try to prevent it. So I'll stop that right there. Have time for another one or two? One. Okay, make it a good one. Oh, come on. Oh, where I'm missing something. What you got? Okay, yeah.
Could you talk just a few minutes about housing costs?
Sure. Housing costs. Right now we have a pretty significant shortage, and housing costs have gone up a lot, and we all know that. What I expect to see happen over the next year or two is continuing increases, but at a much slower rate. I don't see a housing bubble about to burst or anything like that, but I see with mortgage rates likely to edge up a little bit, that's going to temper demand some. A lot of people that got this extra money they didn't need, that was their down payment money. Most of that's been dissipated, so I think you'll see a little bit of a tamping down in the demand right now. We're catching up on some of the inventory and that sort of thing. We're catching up on some of the supply chain issues that slowed it down, but I still think you'll see, on balance, you'll see small increases in housing prices for the next couple of years. Boy, I've just hit y'all with a lot of happy stuff today, hadn't I? It's been a real pleasure. I'm so happy to be back with you. Thank y'all very much.